I'm back with a new video talking about verb phrase. So in the last lecture we talked about grammatical categories of verbs. We said that every English verb must have tense, in which we have two forms of tenses. We have present tense and past tense, and we have four aspects. It is actually three, because the fourth one is the combination of perfective and progressive ones. And every English verb has mood. So we have indicative, imperative, and subjunctive mood, as well as we have voice. Every verb in English must have a voice, whether active and passive. Though there are some verbs which cannot be passivized, these are called intransitive verbs. Okay. So tense, as we said, is the correspondence between the form of the verb and our concept of time. So that's why tense is language specific, while time is universal and non-linguistic. So that's why tense includes past and present. Tense more related to the form of the verb. We don't have future tense, but we have future time, because there is no verb form corresponding to future time. Sometimes we use present continuous, present simple, and even sometimes we use past to express futurity. So aspect defined can be defined as the manner in which a verbal action is experienced or regarded with respect to time. So we have progressive aspect, perfective aspect, simple aspect. These three aspects. So progressive aspect of verbal action experienced as in progress, perfective aspect, verbal action experienced as completed, simple as a simple form of verbs. So tense and aspect are usually intermingled. So as we talked about, tense and aspect are intermingled, so they can come together. So mood, in terms of mood, we are talking about the definition of mood, and then we talk about the types of mood. So mood is a grammatical category that relates the verb action to such conditions such as certainty, obligation, necessity, possibility. These are parts of our mood. So that's why we have three main types of mood: indicative mood, imperative mood, and subjunctive mood. Whenever we talk about mood, every subjunctive mood is indicative, but not necessarily every indicative mood is subjunctive. Why? We will be talking about this. For example, indicative usually is a statement of the facts. She is nice to me is a fact indicative. Imperative, be nice to me. Usually imperatives are commands and requests. Be nice to me. So in this sense is a command. In the case of subjunctive, usually non-factual, sometimes unreal, or sometimes expressing strong emotions. For example, I suggest she be nice to me. So it's a non-factual subjunctive, which is more like a semi-order. I suggest she be nice to me. So in this case, this is called an American version of subjunctive. So in the subjunctive mood, we have mandative, we have formulaic, and we have subjunctive word. So usually in the mandative subjunctive is a kind of indicative mood. So as we said, usually subjunctive mood comes as an indicative form. Why? Because usually every indicative sentence or every statement begins with the subject and ends with a full stop. So this is called indicative. So usually mandative mood found in that clause. That clause is pivotal in the case of mandative one. And we should have verbs like command, recommend, demand, request, insist, suggest, ask. It is necessary that, it's essential that, it's vital that. So usually the form of the verb must be base, and the aim behind using this structure is to be formal. The chairman demands that the farmer kill all his chicken. So in this case, the farmer demands that. So that the farmer kill all his chicken is a noun clause. Why? Because we have the verb demand, and at the same time it's called a mandative subjunctive. It's necessary that every student pay the tuition fee. So it's also a noun clause since we have it's necessary. Whenever we have these kinds of adjectives followed by a that clause, this that clause can function as a noun clause. So formulaic subjunctive, this is a frozen hackneyed expression that is used and we cannot change it. We cannot add intensifiers, modifiers, qualifiers, any other thing. So usually found in clauses in certain sets of expressions, usually the verb is the base. For example, may God bless you, or may God bless you. Long live the king, God save the queen. Come what may, we'll go ahead. So these are what's known as the formulaic subjunctive. Sometimes these are called hackneyed expressions or frozen expressions that we cannot change them. There's another kind of subjunctive which is called subjunctive where. In this kind of subjunctive we usually use where with I, which is something hypothetical or unreal. Usually found in conditional and concessive clauses. So subordinate clauses after verbs like wish and suppose. Usually the subordinate clauses after wish and suppose are also noun clauses. Why? Because usually they function as an object. So usually the form of the verb is were and the meaning is hypothetical or unreal. For example, if I were rich, I would buy you anything you wanted. So instead of saying if I was rich, we say if I were rich. Why? Because so as to hypothesize it or make it unreal. I wish I were you. This is also another example. You cannot be me and I cannot be you. So that's why we cannot do anything about it. Just suppose everyone were to give up smoking. Everyone must be followed by was. But because we have suppose, in this case, where is used so as to make it unreal or hypothetical. So voice is also another grammatical category that every verb should have. So voice is a grammatical category that makes possible to view the action of a sentence in either ways without the change in the facts reported. So in English, we have active voice and passive voice. Usually, the intransitive verbs cannot be passivized. They are usually inactive, while the transitive verbs can be passivized. For example, he ate all the apples. So all the apples, he ate all the apples. All the apples is the object. So we can passivize this sentence. It's inactive. So the dog was bitten by our neighbor. This is passivized. So our neighbor here, our neighbor bit the dog. So the dog was bitten by our neighbor. So originally our neighbor bit the dog. This is passivized. So whenever we talk about intensive complementation, we should have two kinds of structures, SVC and SVA. In this case, the verb should be copular. Remember in the previous lectures we talked about current copula and resulting copula. So in this sense, V must be a copular verb. If the copular verb followed by noun and pronoun, this will noun, pronoun, adjective, this will be a complement. It is specifically known as subject complement. If after the copular verb followed by adverb, prepositional phrase, or function as adverbial. In this sense, it's called adverbial. So usually we have, whenever we have an adjective phrase after the copular verb, we talked about copular verbs. We have current copula and resulting copula. We talked about usually copular verbs are these verbs that can be verb to be and some linking verbs like suppose, like become, like feel, like appear, sound, seem. These are called the copular verbs. So if after copular verbs followed by an adjective phrase, this is called complement, or specifically said as subject complement. And if followed by a noun phrase, so it's also called complement or subject complement. The nominal phrase is also called complement. Nominal phrase is also a kind of phrase that's the center is a noun. So she's so crazy, that's ridiculous. This is so crazy is an adjective phrase. Ridiculous is also an adjective phrase. So this is called SVC. She isn't a good student. A good student is a noun phrase. It appears the only solution. So just notice is and appears are copular verbs followed by a good student. So the head of this phrase is student. So a good is a modifier to student. Appears the only solution. The only is a pre-modifier of solution. So it's a noun phrase. So solution is a noun head. That's why it's called a noun phrase. So here we have SVC. Nominal phrase, we usually, whenever we talk about nominal phrase, these phrases that can be seen as finite clauses and non-finite clause. Whenever we say finite clause, means a kind of clause that is the tense is known. For example, in some situations we have some noun clauses which are called that clauses, or sometimes called finite clauses, followed by the copular verb. For example, the problem is that it costs a lot. That it costs a lot is a that clause, followed by what? Followed by is. WH in interrogative clause is also followed by copular verb. So in this sense, the problem is not who will go. Not who will go is called WH interrogative clause, which is also a kind of finite clause. Why? Because we know the tense, or we know the tense of this clause. Nominal relative clause is a kind of clause that is a kind of noun clause. So usually followed by copular verb like is, what counts most. Non-finite clause are these clauses that we cannot know the tense of the sentence or the clause. So all I did was hit him on the head. Hit him on the head. The tense of this clause is not known. That's why it's called bare infinitive clause, which is a non-finite clause. How do you know the tense? Of course, through was. To infinitive clause, usually without the subject, sometimes with the subject, sometimes without the subject. My wish is to be a pilot. To be a pilot is tenseless. Why? Because you don't have the tense, and this is without the subject. But the idea is for us to meet at 8. Us here is a subject to this non-finite clause, which is to meet at 8. So ing clause is also a kind of non-finite clause. Why? Because we cannot know the tense of it. So seeing is believing. So in the case of voice, we are talking about, we have 3 kinds. In the case of voice, we have transitive and intransitive verbs. In the case of transitive verbs, we have 3 kinds of transitive verbs. verbs, as we mentioned in the previous lectures. So we have monotransitive verbs, ditransitive verbs, and complex transitive verbs. Monotransitive verbs are these verbs in which we have only one subject. Ditransitive verbs, one object. In the case of ditransitive verbs, we have some verbs are followed by two objects because one object cannot complete its meaning. And we have complex transitive verbs. Complex transitive verbs, an object and a complement of the object, or something that comes after the object, which completes its meaning. So this is called a complex transitive verb. How do you know that? You have to check the list of those verbs. Otherwise, you cannot know. So monotransitive verbs, verb complementation, usually whenever we have SVO, we have this kind of structure. So subject, the verb should be monotransitive verb and it's followed by one object, which is sometimes called direct object or OD. So the direct object should be a noun phrase, a finite clause, or sometimes non-finite clause. Okay, as you know, monotransitive verb complementation sometimes followed by a noun phrase. Usually, it is called direct object. Why direct object? We will find out. Usually, this direct object used with passive voice, and usually within this passive voice, sometimes you have phrasal verbs, sometimes you have one-word verbs. Remember in the previous lectures we talked about the structure of verbs. Sometimes you have one-word verbs, sometimes you have phrasal verbs, in which the meaning of the elements cannot be understood from the single elements. Of course, we have different types of phrasal verbs, but here we cannot talk about all the types of phrasal verbs because in the previous lecture we mentioned it. So here we have without passives as well. And then we have prepositional object, and this kind of object, which is we have prepositional verbs and phrasal prepositional verbs. Okay, let's find out. Suppose we say Tom caught the ball. So the ball was caught by Tom. So in this case, caught is a one-word verb in which passivized in this way. The ball was caught by Tom. If we have a phrasal verb, they passed over the question. So passed over is a phrasal verb. Over is does not serve as a preposition here. It's a particle, which is part of the verb passed over. So when we passivize this sentence, we say the question was passed over. Why? Because passed over can be treated as one single element as a phrasal verb. And then, if we take a look at some verbs that usually we cannot change it into passive, but sometimes can be changed into passive. For example, she has a nice house. Has followed by a nice house. So we can say house is had by her in some situations, but this is somehow rare. We have another kind of object, another kind of monotransitive verb, which is followed by a prepositional verb. Means the preposition is part of the verb, not part of the object. So here the management paid for. For is part of paid. Usually, in the case of collocation, paid is collocates. Paid collocates with for and to. But in this case, paid for. So the management paid for his airfares. So his airfares were paid for by the management. So we have a phrasal prepositional verb. The phrasal verb usually followed by a preposition, so which is part of the verb, not part of the object. Because we should have an object, which is a noun phrase. So he looked down on. Looked down on is a phrasal prepositional verb. So them here is what is an object, is a noun phrase object. So they were looked down on. This is how you passivize it. Sometimes monotransitive verb can be seen as a finite clause. Whenever we say finite clause, these clauses that we know the tense. So we have two kinds of finite clause. We have that clause and we have WH clause. In the case of finite clause, we have some of these that clause or some of these WH clauses. You see, I don't care what you are saying. What you are saying is a WH clause which functions as an object. Why? Because care is a monotransitive verb. And what you are saying is a finite clause. Tom doubted whether they would come to the party. This is also a WH clause. I wondered who did make the bed for me. Who did make the bed for me is one object, which is a WH clause. So on and so forth, all the others. Usually after these verbs, care, doubted, wondered, confirmed, realized, know, followed by noun clause, which function as an object. Okay, so that clause can also function as an object as well, whenever functions as a finite clause. So in this case, we have superordinate verbs and subordinate verbs. Whenever we talk about that clause, we talk about two kinds of that clause clauses as objects: superordinate verbs and subordinate verbs. Superordinate verbs are major verbs and minor verbs. Major verbs talking about factual verbs. I'm talking about suasive verbs or persuasive verbs. Minor verbs talking about emotive verbs and hypothesis verbs. So major verbs introduce what might generally describe as factual or propositional information, the kind of information that is there's a proposition in it. They agree, they admit, they claim that she was misled. Whenever we have factual, we have verbs like agree, admit, claim. That she was misled is an object. And usually it's a noun clause. Suasive imply intentions to bring about some change in the future, whether or not these are verbally formulated as commands and suggestions. Whenever there are suggestions, commands, requests, these are called suasive verbs. They are demanding that she leaves. They are demanding that she leaves. In this case, that she leaves is an object. Demanding is a suasive major superordinate verb, which is followed by a that clause. Minor verbs like emotive verbs, talking about emotions, talking about forget, regret, all these kinds of emotional verbs. I regret that she worried. So it's a kind of subjunctive case as well. And then hypothesis, especially in the case of wish, which is a minor hypothetical superordinate verb followed by a that clause as an object. So I wish that he were here. Because of wish, we have were as a subjunctive case. In the case of subordinate verb, we have indicative verbs, putative should, and subjunctive verbs. Indicative verbs are these verbs that we have. Remember, we talked about indicative verb which are also subjunctive. So I recommended that he be there or he be here. So because of recommended, talking about an indication, indicating something, is a kind of statement because starts with the subject and ends with a full stop. So I recommend that he be here. That he be here is an indicative. The verb is indicative, recommend, and that he be here is a finite clause was function as an object. So the verb is a subordinate verb. Putative should usually we have to have should, especially in the British version of subjunctive. I insist that he shouldn't smoke. Originally in American English, they say, I insist that he smoke, that he not smoke. Sorry, I insist that he not smoke. But in this case, we have a putative should because we have insist, which is a subjunctive case, but the British version. We have subjunctive verbs, all these verbs that we have been talking about. I require that he give up smoking. That he give up smoking is a finite clause which functions as an object preceded by a subjunctive subordinate verb. So, monotransitive verb complementation by a non-finite clause. This time we don't have a finite clause. We have a non-finite clause, in which a tenseless clause, as we said. But again, once again, I should reiterate the fact that this non-finite clause function as an object, which is the verb is a monotransitive verb. Sometimes there is subject with it, sometimes there is no subject with it, sometimes there is WH infinitive clause. So if we have subject, I don't like the house to be left empty. The house to be left empty, this is a de facto subject. There's a kind of subject here, but it's not a full subject for this non-finite clause, but it is there. The house to be left empty, this is a kind of de facto subject that we can see it. To be left empty is a non-finite clause, but there's a subject with it, which is to infinitive clause. We have ing participle clause. I dislike him driving my car. Him driving my car is an ing participle with subject non-finite clause. Driving my car is a non-finite clause with a subject, him, and all of them function as one object. Without a subject, Mary longed to leave home. So in this case, here we don't have the subject, and we have what's known as a non-finite clause, to leave home, which is a to infinitive clause. And then we have ing participle clause, which is a kind of clause that is non-finite but starts with ing. For example, Mary loves. Loves is a verb. Listening to music is an ing participle clause without the subject. And then we have another kind of WH infinitive clause, which is a non-finite clause. For example, I know what to do. What to do, this sentence has what's known as know, which is followed by a noun clause. This noun clause has a WH followed by a non-finite clause, which is to do, what to do. So what to do is a non-finite clause, which is called non-finite infinitive WH clause. Okay, whenever we talk about ditransitive verbs, we have two kinds of objects. So students, this is all for today's lecture about monotransitive verbs. Though it's important to know that ditransitive verbs also, the same things that we talked about can be applied to ditransitive verbs, in which we have two objects. And that's all for today. Goodbye.